So this is Isopanisad mantra 11. Vidyam cha yas tad vedo bhayam saha avidyayam mrityum tirtva vidyayam mrityam ashnate. Only one who can learn the process of nescience and that of transcendental knowledge side by side can transcend the influence of repeated birth and death and enjoy the full blessings of immortality. Prabhupada says, since the creation of the material world, everyone has been trying to attain a permanent life, but the laws of nature are so cruel that no one has been able to avoid the hand of death. No one wants to die, nor does anyone want to become old or diseased. The laws of nature, however, do not allow anyone immunity from old age, disease, and death, nor has the advancement of material knowledge solved these problems. Material science can discover the nuclear bomb to accelerate the process of death, but it cannot discover anything that can protect man from the cruel hands of old age, disease, and death. Okay, so as we see in this verse, there's great emphasis on mrityum tirtva vidyam mrityam ashnate, that you can attain immortality by essentially developing knowledge, and transcendental knowledge in particular. And this is really the goal, the purushartha, the fourth purushartha of all living beings, right? There's dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. And so the desire for liberation is there within all of us. It's one of the fundamental needs of human beings. This is often one of the focuses of religion, is it's offering people different varieties of liberation. Because it's not natural for us to live in a temporary condition. As you move throughout life, you see, ultimately, as time goes on, as you get a little older especially, you see that everything is temporary. And everything that you love, everything you care for, it's eventually going to dwindle and die. Everything that you're attached to, right? Like if you live around long enough, you're the last man standing, like everything, like say, like what is this, remember these movies, The Highlander?
Yeah.
Or like there can be only one, something like that, right? So, if you were like that, if you lived for hundreds of years, not only would all of your family die and everyone you loved died, and everyone you ever knew died, and even your ancestors, your children would all die, but even the nation you were born in would completely change and die, right? The whole continent would change. The whole material world's constantly going through processes of change. And it doesn't stay in one place for very long at all. And so it's part of life to essentially be constantly surrounded by death and destruction. And even before destruction, there's old age and disease, which are very miserable conditions. So Prabhupada makes a very interesting point here that material science, it can only accelerate this process, right? Like one of the great advertisements of modern society and the hope of modern society is really science and technology will solve all the problems of life. As I mentioned before, they're tinkering with the human genome, trying to somehow or other, perfect human existence. If we just find that DNA particle which causes death, we can just take it out, Well, we could find that DNA switch that causes old age to happen, we'll just remove it, right? So people believe that you can somehow change the nature of reality through science and technology, and yet really, this is really kind of a startling claim that you're only able to accelerate the process. Like it's basically the kind of faith that people have in science as some kind of savior. It's actually the opposite. In fact, it only adds to the destructive nature of reality. In other words, nature itself is built with destruction inherent within it. It's within the computer code of nature, right? It's like, for example, if you build something out of water, it's always going to be wet, Or you build something out of mud, it's always going to be muddy. You're always going to have mud on your hands, right? So similarly, nature itself there's death, there's old age, there's disease. It's really imprinted within the very structure of nature itself. And whatever you build or create, it's going to also be subjected to it. Say, I'm going to build a machine, I'm going to build something that will save everyone from death. But the very elements that you build it out of have death within it. The machine itself will get old and die, right? The machine itself has to constantly be repaired. You build like a live forever ray that you somehow zap people with and they live forever. And then you're always trying to repair it and it never works. The machine itself won't live forever. Does that make sense? And so it's kind of like, because we have this nature impregnated within us, whatever we create also has that within it. You know? And therefore, you'll see that people actually believe, if we can engineer the human genome, even though such things are far beyond our intelligence, still we can somehow get in there and manipulate it. And also, people want to now add, make human beings biomechanical. We can add things to your body, biotechnology, and somehow or other make you better because you're half robot. And this is where people are trying to push society, like they actually have faith. But you're just going to create, and you'll see that, people create movies and things like that are, what's the right word I'm looking for? It shows like a dystopian future. Yeah, like, what is that, Blade Runner or something, where it's like, people are kind of messed with their own genetics and everything, and everyone's kind of like the worse for it. So there's this kind of instinctive sense that the more that we try to somehow fix our condition, the worse it gets, the more hopeless it gets and desperate, right? And so according to Prabhupada here, that's a fact, because the very things that we work with are filled with the imperfections of our own condition, okay? So from the Puranas we learn the activities of Hiranyakashipu, a king who was very much advanced materially, wanting to conquer cruel death by his material acquisitions and the strength of his nescience. He underwent a type of meditation so severe that the inhabitants of the planetary systems became disturbed by his mystic powers. He forced the creator of the universe, the demigod Brahma, to come down to him. He then asked Brahma for the benediction of becoming Amara, which means one does not die. Brahma said he does not award the benediction because even he, the material creator who rules all planets, is not Amara. As confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita, Brahma lives a long time, but that does not mean he is immortal. So we can see, like, just what we're talking about, even Brahma, the creator of the universe, he himself understands this principle, right? Like, you don't see him trying to create immortal beings. You don't see him trying to adjust the DNA so people live forever or something, because he himself is subjected to death. So he knows it's fruitless. Hari Hari. So Hiranya means gold, and Kashipu means soft bed. This cunning gentleman, Hiranyakashipu, was interested in these two things, money and women, and he wanted to enjoy them by becoming immortal. He asked from Brahma many benedictions in the hope of indirectly fulfilling his desire to become immortal. Since Brahma told him that he could not grant the gift of immortality, Hiranyakashipu requested that he not be killed by any man, animal, god, or any other living being within the 8,400,000 species. He also asked that he not die on land, in air, or water, or by any weapon. In this way, Hiranyakashipu foolishly thought that these guarantees would save him from death. Ultimately, however, although Brahma granted him all these benedictions, he was killed by the personality of Godhead in the form of Nrsimha, the half-lion, half-man incarnation, and no weapon was used to kill him, for he was killed by the Lord's nails. Nor was he killed on the land, or in the air, or on the water, for he was killed in the lap of that wonderful living being Nrsimha, who is beyond his conception. The whole point is that even Hiranyakashipu, the most powerful of materialists, could not become deathless by his various plans. What then can be accomplished by the tiny Hiranyakashipus of today, whose plans are thwarted from moment to moment? So we're all familiar with the story, so I don't need to go into more detail. But basically, it's illustrative of our attempt, the demoniac attempt, to try to somehow subvert the very nature of reality. Right? Remember, demons, they don't accept the Shastra as mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita. And really, they don't accept the world as the Lord created it. And there's no... with the divine characters that you see nature itself and you understand its relationship with the Supreme Lord and how it's constructed and for what's purpose. And you don't rebel against that, right? Whereas, as Prabhupada mentions, for the atheist, ultimately God comes as death. Like you can't rebel against nature itself. You can't change the way that nature is. You can't challenge the authority of God as it exists in the world in the form of death, in the form of old age, disease, all these things. You can't somehow subvert Krishna's will and transform the world into a place for your enjoyment. Right? That's what we want. We want heaven without God in it. Yeah, we want to create this world and turn it into a heaven where we can enjoy our senses eternally in forgetfulness of Krishna. And so this is the demoniac plan. And we see that, Hiranyakashipu, he's sort of illustrating this way, this kind of desperate way of trying to somehow make it happen, so to somehow trick Krishna or bypass all the laws, find a loophole, right? And yet it doesn't work. There's no way that you can go beyond Krishna's authority. And you'll see this in the Bible also, the stories of, building the stairway to heaven or Babylon, like you're somehow trying to challenge the authority of God and force your way into heaven. We don't need we don't need to surrender to God to get into heaven. We'll build a stairway, right? And we'll just kick down the doors of Vaikuntha if there's enough of us. And Ravan, of course, tried to do the same thing, right? He actually tried to build a stairway to the heavenly planets. Forget all these sacrifices. I'm going to take everyone with me, right? And today, Ravan would be considered a great hero, wouldn't he? You think about it, if Ravan, he's like the great rebel. All the gods are holding the people out of heaven, and then he's somehow going to just kick the doors open and tell everyone on earth, come on, come with me. We're taking it for ourselves. No more gods, no more heroes. Yeah? In fact, I think there's some prominent modern philosopher, which said, there'll be peace on earth when the last priest is choked with the intestines of the last king. Right? No more gods, no more kings, no more priests, no more religion, no more authority. We just tear open the doors of heaven and the people take it. Right? And so this is kind of the mood of Ravan. He would be cheered as a great hero. And so anyway, so this is the mood of Hiranyakashipu too. He's challenging God and he's challenging the world. He's a tragic hero from the modern perspective. But from the Vedic perspective, he's a fool. And so he was ultimately destroyed, right? Just what do they call that? The hubris is considered one of, in Greek mythology, one of the characteristics or faults or weaknesses of heroes, or even, the tragic individuals in plays and stories is hubris. They challenge the gods and then they fall. You've heard of Icarus. He was the one who his father built him wings that he could fly. Even though it's not man's nature to fly, the gods didn't endow man with the capacity to fly. He built his own son wings, and he himself, and then they flew up too high to the sun, and the wax on the wings melted, and they fell down, right? So it's the same type of, that's in the Western culture, that's glorified, right? Look how great they are that they've challenged the gods, and they failed heroically, And yet in the Vedas, you'll see that people that do that are considered illustrations of the demonic mentality, right? But it's that same desire to be amara, to be deathless, to somehow challenge the laws of nature that are there. And so that's also, in the modern context, it's not so much that the heroes are people, building wings of wax, but they're individuals who are trying to use science and technology to manipulate the genome, or to somehow or other, just challenge nature itself and build that stairway. Okay? So let's take a look here. It says the Sri Isopanisad instructs us not to make one-sided attempts to win the struggle for existence. Everyone is struggling hard for existence, but the laws of material nature are so hard and fast that they do not allow anyone to surpass them. In order to attain a permanent life, one must be prepared to go back to Godhead. All right? So it's kind of like, imagine if you were in a prison, and really the prison warden and the guards, they have a pretty strict rule, right? If you want to taste freedom, you have to be a good prisoner, and you have to earn your freedom. You have to go before the parole board, and they have to assess your character. And then, then one day they'll open that gate, and you'll walk out into the sunshine, and, you'll stand there and taste freedom for the first time in a long time. But what if you decided, no, we're just going to we're going to create freedom in the prison, right? And they try to do that. It's called a riot. We'll kill all the guards, and we'll somehow, we'll destroy all the authority. We'll take over the prison, and we'll turn it into heaven on earth. Even if we're not able to go outside, we want to burst the doors open and, take the whole world over if we can. But at least we'll make the prison into a nice place. And therefore, people do that. It's called smuggling drugs in your butt, right? That's what people do. They smuggle, heroin through their anus or whatever, and they somehow get drugs into prison, and they create their little utopia. There's one little cell everyone goes to, and they get high on whatever chemicals they can find in the kitchen, and you know what I mean? So, and therefore, then the warden has his guards go look and try to root it out, and take. So, this is the demoniac mentalities. We want to create within the prison a sense of freedom, a sense of enjoyment, whereas the authorities, they want us to actually attain real freedom by leaving the prison, but we have to surrender in order to do that. Okay. So the process by which one goes back to God, it is a different branch of knowledge, and it has to be learned from the revealed scriptures such as the Upanishads, Vedanta Sutra, Bhagavad Gita, and Srimad Bhagavatam. To become happy in this life and attain a permanent blissful life after leaving the material body, one must study the sacred literature and obtain transcendental knowledge. Okay, so now you have a whole branch of knowledge which is teaching you the truth of the reality outside the prison house and how to become qualified to leave. These are the higher transcendental knowledge, the para vidya. Okay? So the conditioned living being has forgotten his eternal relationship with God and has mistakenly accepted the temporary place of his birth as all in all. The Lord has kindly delivered the above-mentioned scriptures in India and other scriptures in other countries to remind the forgetful human being that his home is not here in this material world. The living being is a spiritual entity, and he can be happy only by returning to his spiritual home. From his kingdom, the personality of Godhead sends his bona fide servants to propagate this message, by which one can return to Godhead, and sometimes the Lord comes himself to do this work. Since all living beings are his beloved sons, his parts and parcels, God is more sorry than we ourselves to see the sufferings we are constantly undergoing in this material condition. The miseries of this material world serve to indirectly remind us of our incompatibility with dead matter. Intelligent living entities generally take note of these reminders and engage themselves in the culture of vidya, or transcendental knowledge. All right, so you'll see that it's not that Krishna or God is just cold toward the suffering of the world. He's put you in this prison. It's a miserable place. There's birth, death, old age, and disease. And he doesn't care. He's playing softball in Vrindavan or something, right? He's busy out there enjoying. He's like a rich man, living on a hill above the ghetto, who really doesn't care what's going on down there. Maybe he even enjoys it, right? So this is kind of like the accusations towards God. No, God is actually more unhappy with the suffering in the world than ourselves. But he doesn't interfere with our free will. He allows us to create the conditions by which we suffer, because that's our freedom to do so. He doesn't make the world. The world is inherently temporary, but he doesn't accelerate the condition, right? For example, if you look in Satya Yuga and in places where human beings have higher consciousness, these elements of birth, death, old age, and disease are not so intense. Like we're the ones who actually accelerate it by our own free will, in choosing to become sinful. And there's places even like in the heavenly planets where, practically speaking, birth, death, old age, and disease don't exist. There is death, but there's no old age and no disease. And even death isn't like a very painful experience, So there are places within the world that one can go to experience, as good as it gets. But inherent within nature, he does put the temporary aspect, right? He does make it so that nothing lasts forever, and that's in order to remind us that we can't really be happy here. Right? Does that make sense? So it's not that Krishna makes the world a place of horrible suffering. He makes it a place that's temporary, but we're the ones who then create, more and more suffering within it by our own sinful nature. We sort of by pursuing our sinful desires, collectively we develop the karma by which we all suffer tremendously. We turn up the heat, basically by our own ignorance. But he does make nature temporary. Yeah? And so the purpose of this is because ultimately just being separate from him is a kind of suffering. And he wants us, even beyond, even if we were to somehow make the world a place that was eternal and full of bliss and happiness, we would have the kingdom of God without God in it, still we wouldn't be happy. We would still be suffering because we're separate from him. And therefore he makes the world temporary to remind us that this isn't our home, that we have to move on. Right? It's just like, have you ever seen these, you have a homeless camp or something like that? Or you have people that live in a bunch of RVs or campers, around LA. There's thousands upon thousands. I don't even know how many. It's 100,000 people that live in RVs and different stuff like that. It's It's like 18 to 20 million people that live in the LA area. It's like one of the most populated areas on earth. But there's like hundreds of thousands of people that are just kind of roaming around the city. And they're staying, in different corners and whatever. You've seen them all over the place. So the police are constantly moving everyone on, right? Like if you stay in a certain place for a couple days, they come with their nightstick and knock on the door, dunk, 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 LAPD, whatever. And you got to go out there and talk to them, and they say, and they may not even tell you to go. They're just saying like, so how you doing? Wink, wink. The neighbors, yeah. Oh, I smell marijuana coming from here. So, the neighbors have been complaining about noise, or, what I mean? They're telling you got to move on. You can't just live here, right? You can't just set up, your bicycle fixing station, right? Where you fix bicycles for $5, and you can't set up your store on the sidewalk in your home right there. They keep you moving, right? So it's the same thing with the material world. Krishna comes, when you're 80 years old, knock, 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 horrible, right? You can't just keep staying in this body, right? It's time to move on. You got to keep it moving, you got to keep the flow, rotation going. We're all essentially homeless, in other words, in this material world. It's not a real home. It's not an eternal home because it's not a home, right? It's the spiritual world's our home. That's where we actually live. This body is just an RV. It's just it's a camping. We're all camping, right? so that's the nature of the material world, and you got to keep on moving until finally you go home. Yeah, because that's what it means to be homeless. You don't have a place that you actually live that's actually steady and stable. Yeah, so that's what it is. I mean, that's what happens. Like people leave their home in the morning, and then they just keep moving around, and you don't really stop moving until you come back home, isn't it? So it's the same thing in the material world. As soon as we leave the spiritual world, we don't stop moving. We're just moving around and around and around until we go home. Okay? So let's see here. Where was I? Human life. Yeah, human life is the best opportunity for the culture of spiritual knowledge. And a human being who does not take advantage of this opportunity is called a Naradama, or the lowest of human beings. Okay, so this knowledge that Krishna gives to leave the material world, the human body is built to interact with that knowledge. This is what's interesting. It's not just that, Krishna gives this knowledge into the world. There's a certain life form that you take which plugs into that knowledge. Just like Bhakti Original, he's asking everyone, do you have an adapter? Do you have an adapter? Do you have an adapter? Right? So because only a certain adapter will work with that laptop, and he doesn't have it. So it's the same thing that the human form of life, it's like adapted to the Vedic knowledge, or to religion in general, as it's spread throughout the world by Krishna. The human being is meant to plug into that. That's what we are. We're an adapter plug to the Vedas. Yeah, you're living right now in a plug that adapts to the Vedas and adapts to spiritual knowledge. Okay? The path, and if you don't use it, then you're a Naradama. Like if you're just you're like one of those plugs you find out by the garbage. It's like it's not being used. Yeah, it's just sitting there, like getting rained on. Okay, so the path of avidya, or advancement of material knowledge for sense gratification, is the path of repeated birth and death. As he exists spiritually, the living entity has no birth or death. Birth and death apply to the outward covering of the spirit soul of the body. Death is compared to the taking off, and birth to the putting on of outward garments. Foolish human beings who are grossly absorbed in the culture of avidya, or nescience, do not mind this cruel process. Enamored with the beauty of the illusory energy, they undergo the same miseries repeatedly and do not learn any lesson from the laws of nature. So if you're somewhat advanced, then as you go through material existence, you start to wonder, what the heck is this? What am I doing? And ultimately, how do I get out of this? Right? But a lot of people don't. They just continue to experience material existence, birth after birth, and they don't really they take the licks and they keep on ticking. Imagine if you had an individual who, he's walking along a street of a certain road in a certain village or something. Every doorway he goes to and knocks on, somebody just comes out with a stick and beats him over the head. And then he goes to the next door and someone beats him over the head, and the next one and the next one. And if you're somewhat smart, you start to think, maybe I should leave this village, maybe I should move on, right? But most people, or a large amount of people, they just keep on going to door after door after door, right? And so, after getting beat over the head quite a bit, you start to wonder and question, what the heck is wrong with this village? What's going on here? I need to make a solution, yeah? Okay, so now there is another form of knowledge which isn't completely spiritual. There's material knowledge. But material knowledge is part of the cycle of birth and death, right? It doesn't have any true inherent spiritual value. It's basically like the vehicle that you use to move from door to door. And so even though it may be necessary, and that's kind of what this verse is about, that you may cultivate material knowledge and spiritual knowledge side by side. Now, because you can use material knowledge to support your body, etc., which is ultimately meant for self-realization. So, for example, you're going to school or something like that, you're getting a degree, and the purpose is so that you can maintain your existence. But the real purpose of that, the ultimate purpose of that existence is to go back to Godhead. Does that make sense? So you have to see material knowledge and spiritual knowledge in their proper relationship to each other. Okay? So therefore the culture of vidya or transcendental knowledge is essential for the human being. Sense enjoyment is in the diseased material condition, must be restricted as far as possible. Unrestricted sense enjoyment in this bodily condition is the path of ignorance and death. The living entities are not without spiritual senses. Every living being in his original spiritual form has all the senses which are now materially manifested, being covered by the material body and mind. The activities of the material senses are perverted reflections of the activities of the original spiritual senses. In his diseased condition, the spirit soul engages in material activities under the material covering. Real sense enjoyment is possible only when the disease of materialism is removed. In our pure spiritual form, free from all material contamination, real enjoyment of the senses is possible. A patient must regain his health before he can truly enjoy sense pleasure again. Thus, the aim of human life should not be to enjoy perverted sense enjoyment, but to cure the material disease. Aggravation of the material disease is no sign of knowledge, but a sign of avidya, ignorance. For good health, a person should not increase his fever from 105 degrees to 107, but should reduce his temperature to the normal 98.6. That should be the aim of human life. The modern trend of material civilization is to increase the temperature of the feverish material condition, which has reached the point of 107 degrees in the form of atomic energy. Meanwhile, the foolish politicians are crying that at any moment the world may go to hell. That is the result of the advancement of material knowledge and the neglect of the most important part of life, the culture of spiritual knowledge. Isopanisad herein warns that we must not follow this dangerous path leading to death. On the contrary, must develop the culture of spiritual knowledge so that we may become completely free from the cruel hands of death. So the nature of material knowledge is if you just cultivate that without cultivating spiritual knowledge, you're only increasing the fever of material existence, which you'll see, especially in Western civilization, really all over the world. Even in India, if you look at India and Pakistan are constantly pointing each other's nukes at each other, right? Or India and China. So this is the result of a lack of spiritual knowledge. Right? Of course, people may try to kill each other over religion. That's very common, probable. But that's not actually spiritual knowledge. When you see people fighting over religion, it means that they have no understanding of religion, right? But if you just simply increase materialism, what you're doing is you're increasing the fire of material existence. You're increasing the suffering that's there. You're making it more intense. Just to go around Los Angeles. Like if you just live in Los Angeles, you can see how miserable it is, right? How intense it is just driving around. That's super intense. Just like going from one place to another, there's so much stress, there's so much pain, there's so much conflict and competition, right? And people are suffering tremendously. Like Los Angeles is basically, it's almost like a hell on earth, And yet, if you look at traditionally the material society that Vedic culture advocates, it's like living simply in the countryside, living in a village, surrounded by farmland, right? It's much more peaceful, much more relaxed, and that's considered material life. That's not spiritual life. That's actually a materialistic environment, according to the Vedas. But because it's mixed with spiritual knowledge, people deliberately keep it simple, and they deliberately keep it, like wealth is the beauty of nature, and wealth is clean and, wholesome food, etc. Whereas if you take away that spiritual culture and you just keep amping up materialism, industrial revolution, agricultural revolution, technological revolution, computer revolution. You just keep, increasing the temperature more and more and more of materialism, then people, the heat of it, the suffering, the illness that people feel, it becomes more and more intense as well. Does that make sense? So modern civilization is kind of like we're just stoking the fire of materialism, and the more that you stoke it, the more people are suffering, and the more they're miserable. Now, of course, there are certain things that exist in traditional agricultural society that we're suffering, especially like diseases, like modern medicine has really helped out to wipe out viruses and stuff like that. I mean, these things are certainly very helpful. But in general, people are happy living a much more simple, peaceful life in harmony with nature. Okay? I mean, in other words, when we talk about nature and living in a village and stuff like that, we're not talking about living in the Dark Ages in Europe with the Black Plague and stuff like that, right? Those people have a tendency to think. Before the Industrial Revolution, people would throw their urine and feces out their window, into the middle of the street where it flowed down a small little gutter, and everyone with rats running all over the place, and people only bathed once a week. That we're not talking about that, right? that's like European culture. We're talking about traditional life where people bathe constantly. They're very clean, and they have clean farming practices, so there's not so much disease, and all these types of things, right? All right, like a more of a sattvic farming life. Let's see. It says here. Okay. This does not mean that activities for the maintenance of the body should be stopped. There is no question of stopping activities, just as there is no question of wiping out one's temperature altogether when trying to recover from a disease. To make the best use of a bad bargain is the appropriate expression. The culture of spiritual knowledge necessitates the help of the body and mind. Therefore, maintenance of the body and mind is required if we are to reach our goal. The normal temperature should be maintained at 98.6 degrees, and the great sages and saints of India have attempted to do this by a balanced program of spiritual and material knowledge. They never allow the misuse of human intelligence for diseased sense gratification. Okay, so you're not trying to all of a sudden just make everyone liberated, We're going to somehow, walk around and just either force everyone to somehow go back to Godhead, or, just force everyone to become spiritually advanced immediately. Right? We're not supposed to do that. Nor do you walk around, telling everyone to take sannyas. Right? It's a gradual process that sometimes take lifetimes. Of course, with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mercy and the holy name, etc., it can happen very quickly. But in general, the whole process of becoming detached from matter, it's gradual. It's meant to be sort of like, I don't know if holistic is the right word, but more practical and sort of like in harmony with nature itself and in harmony with your nature. It's really meant to be something that is, like for Krishna consciousness, we should have a very broad perspective where we're encouraging people at whatever their level to make advancement. We're not trying to take one medicine and force it down everyone's throat, right? This is the way, the truth, and the light. You have to take it. You have to take it now, and you have to take it fanatically, and you have to apply yourself, and destroy your entire life and give everything up in order to, somehow follow this very narrow path that I'm giving you. And it's the only path, and if you don't take it, you're doomed. Right? That's not actually spiritual life. Spiritual life is more of like, you're encouraging people wherever they're at. You can, even as a devotee, you can encourage people that aren't even Vaishnavas. Encourage a Muslim or Christian or Jew or whatever, to follow their particular path, right? And go at their particular speed and follow their laws in order to gradually make advancement. So the point is that it's a gradual process, and you have to have a broad enough picture in order to help people along it at the speed that they can travel, which is comfortable and appropriate to them, right? And therefore, material knowledge can also be encouraged if it's if it's supporting spiritual knowledge. You should encourage people to live happy, comfortable, peaceful lives that are where they're sort of nourished and getting what they need to live peacefully. Does that make sense? Even when you see, like, when a spiritual master comes, like His Holiness Devamrita Swami, right? Most of what he does when he talks to his disciples, he's not talking about spiritual life, Most of it, like when the guru sits with all the disciples and talks to each one-on-one, very rarely are they talking about, Guru Dev, I have a question about Bhagavad Gita 18.5. It's always like, my marriage, my career, my this, my that, what should I do, what should I do, what should I do, right? Because these are where all the problems are. The problems are not with 18.5, right? All the problems are with how to arrange material energy. And so the guru sits and he basically tells you how to arrange your material life in a way that it's going to be helpful for your spiritual life. It's kind of like he's speaking to you, thinking of your spiritual goal, and then trying to help you to see how you can do that with your material condition, right? And so, that's basically, that's the primary thing people go to talk about, So that, the whole point is that material life is not necessarily bad or evil, and nor do you encourage people to give it up falsely or to somehow put themselves in a condition where they're not happy. Where they're not being fulfilled, they're not being nourished, they don't have the things they need materially, right? Rather, you encourage people to be responsible materially and to be comfortable materially and to sort of be as happy as possible materially. But the purpose of that is so that people can then, from that position, make spiritual advancement. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So human activities diseased by a tendency towards sense gratification have been regulated in the Vedas under the principles of salvation. This system employs religion, economic development, sense gratification, and salvation. But at the present moment, people have no interest in religion or salvation. They have only one aim in life, sense gratification. In order to achieve this end, they make plans for economic development. Misguided men think that religion should be maintained because it contributes to economic development, which is required for sense gratification. This in order to guarantee further sense gratification after death. In heaven there is some system of religious observance, but this is not the purpose of religion. The path of religion is actually meant for self-realization, and economic development is required just to maintain the body in a sound, healthy condition. A man should lead a healthy life with a sound mind just to realize vidya, true knowledge, which is the aim of human life. This life is not meant for working like an ass or for culturing avidya for sense gratification. Okay, so there's the purusharthas are dharma, artha, kama, and moksha, right? And so dharma means essentially religion, but it really means varnashram dharma. It means performing your duties according to your nature, as it's given to you in the laws of God, right? Acting according to your nature in accordance with the laws of God. And if you do that, which oftentimes translates as doing your job in society, then there is economic development. Then money will come to you, either directly in the form of a paycheck or in the form of rains that create grains, which create, which feed the cows and feed yourself, and fruits in the fields and all these things. In other words, nature itself and the demigods, they reciprocate with your performance of religious duties by giving you all the things that you need to live. And then when you have those things, then there's kama, or sense gratification, right? You have your family, you have your wife, your children, your home, all these different things, your friends. You have society itself, you have the pious pursuit of material satisfaction and happiness. And then once you follow that particular path, then you will eventually become frustrated. You'll eventually develop the desire to leave the material world. That's moksha. And that's kind of like and there's also love of God, which is a higher purushartha. But basically, human society culminates in the desire for liberation. Now, what you'll find today is that people have let's just say also you'll see that human society kind of goes through this cycle throughout the day, too. Like when you get up in the morning, the first thing people do is go to work, right? Slap a piece of toast in your mouth and some orange juice, and make your way out the door, right? Grab your hat and, into the brisk fog you run. And catch the bus or jump in your car, and you're on your way to work. It's your dharma. And then you take your money, artha, you go buy things at the store. On the way home, you stop at Whole Foods or whatever, and your artha, you're getting your grains, you're getting everything, you're, basically transforming your money, your artha, into the various things that you need for enjoyment. And then you take those home, and then the rest of the night, the next 3 hours or whatever is kama. There's sense gratification, play with the kids, watch a movie, eat some food, then you go to bed and, maybe there's sex or whatever, right? That's all kama. And then finally, at the end, there's moksha, you go to sleep, right? You enter into liberation. People have whatever it is, I was going to say Jay Leno, but that's outdated. Now it's like Conan O'Brien or whatever, playing on the television set. And they attain liberation, right? So that kind of, dissolution from reality. So that's moksha. So you'll see that human society follows this kind of path throughout the day, right? Now, in modern society, there's no attention to dharma. People perform a job, but they don't follow any religious principles. It's not according to the laws of God. And the real purpose is just artha and kama. It's like a society that abandons dharma and moksha and is just focused on making money and getting sense gratification. That's basically it. And so it's a very cold and hard life. It's not very satisfying. And nor does it lead to liberation. Okay? So that's a serious concern. And so when you follow dharma, then what happens, like if you enter into this cycle, which we all follow this cycle, but you have it rooted in dharma, then you see the whole purpose of it. Like each thing is used for its proper purpose, which is ultimately liberation, right? Like if you're fixed in dharma, then you understand that your job is moving you towards liberation. Then when you go to the store, you buy all the things, you understand, you do it in the light of liberation. And when you have sense gratification, you do it in the light of liberation. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So like when you're fixed in dharma, you see the whole purpose of the whole cycle and how it's supposed to work. And generally what it does is it minimizes everything. Like if you're doing it according to dharma, then your artha will be minimized. You're only going to make enough money that you need to live comfortably. And you're not going to be like, greedy and just using all your time and energy to make money as much as possible. And the sense gratification that you enjoy will also be according to the Shastra. It's also going to be minimized. Rather than going out to a strip club and, and throwing alcohol on the stripper and, with money and getting drunk with all your friends or whatever, right? People do these things. Then you're going to be going home and sitting with your family or with your wife and children and, whatever, chanting bhajans or something, and there's some sense gratification there, right? So in this way, that principle of sense gratification is had according to the Shastra, and it's minimized and it's in a way that elevates you. And then finally, that will ultimately lead to liberation. Okay? Whereas modern society, if there is any dharma being followed, they don't follow it for liberation or even love of God. They just follow it for sense gratification. As Prabhupada points out here, people basically, you're either practicing religion because you want to enjoy now in the world, or you want to enjoy in heaven. Like you'll see certain groups within Christianity or Islam or whatever. You'll find that if you listen to the sermon from the priest, he's standing up there and he's talking, may even be like extremely well spoken, well dressed, and looking very, very handsomely, shaved beard and everything like that, and looks like a very expert speaker. Like just the whole crowd is watching and they're all mesmerized. But what is he talking about? He's talking about all the things that you need to do in order to go to heaven and in order to enjoy the virgins, in order to go and enjoy sense gratification there, basically. He's not even really talking about worship of God or surrender to God or loving God. It's just all about, you follow this particular, this kind of like, how would you say this? You make a deal with God and you follow these particular rules, and God will reward you by giving you sense gratification, right? Why go live in a mansion here in London, in a very expensive area of London? Why go live in a mansion there when you can have a mansion that God will give you, where you walk in and it's filled with all sorts of sense gratification, and beautiful women walking around and everything, right? It's all for you, and you just follow this particular path or adhere to these principles, and you'll get it. That's basically what religion is nowadays. Yeah, and there's many Christian groups are oftentimes saying the same thing. Not all, many Christians will emphasize love of God and everything like that. But sometimes it's just, we want to enjoy, we want to go to heaven and there everything's going to be nice. And, like if you look at the back of these Christian tracts that you sometimes find blowing around, in the alleyways, it's like got a picture of, you're standing there and, like I've said this before, basically, like it's like a beautiful valley with a bunch of people sitting there, and your family's there, grandpa, grandma, all your best friends, everybody's there, and they're all like playing volleyball or whatever, It's like a picnic, and you've got all the lions and the tigers are all together and they don't kill each other. And basically and even their concept isn't even that you necessarily go to heaven, but that the earth itself transforms into heaven. right? Like once the end at the end of when Jesus comes and there's the revelations is fulfilled, and then the earth itself becomes a heavenly planet, and everyone's there enjoying. And Jesus is, God. He's not really a person, so he's just kind of like a voice in the sky or whatever. He's doing his own thing. He's none of our business. It's offensive to even think about it, right? But Jesus, he comes as like a celebrity. He's like the celebrity guest, and he walks around the picnic and kind of says hi to everyone, and then goes to the next picnic like that. And so that's heaven, right? That's the whole goal of religion. And so you'll find this type of conception. And then, or you can just find that we want to have a nice, happy life here and now, right? Like I grew up in the ghetto, and it's really tough, and it's miserable. There's drug addiction. There's all sorts of problems. There's broken homes, broken families. But I'm going to somehow surrender to Jesus, right? I'm going to surrender to, the Catholic Church or whatever. Or I'm going to become a Mormon, and then my life will be peaceful, right? They'll set me up with a nice wife and a nice family and a nice house, a nice job. And in this way, if I just live a religious life and I get my family to be religious, then my life will stop being so chaotic, and life itself will be more enjoyable. Does that make sense? There's a lot of people practice religion like that. It's not about loving God. I mean, there are people, of course. I'm not trying to categorize all Christians or all this or all that. I mean, there's a lot of Hindus like that too, right? Worship the demigods, Jai Ma, give me this, give me that, right? So, but the idea is that most people, when they practice religion, they practice it with the intention of either enjoying in heaven, but more and more so, just enjoying now in the world. Either give me this or give me that, or I can actually live a more peaceful and happy life if I'm religious. Does that make sense? Okay. So you'll find that if you actually talk to religious people, that's oftentimes why they're religious. I got my family; they're all Christian and stuff, and therefore they're good people. And we all have a good, strong family, right? I'm a Christian, and I have a nice property and a nice business and stuff like that, and my life is kind of together because we follow these principles of pious life. And even my family, like somehow or other, we were able to keep all of the kids. They grew up and they have their kids, but they all live like within 20, 30 miles of each other, right? And it's really nice. I get to go see the grandkids, and I live kind of like a nice, happy life because we've got this strong family, and it's centered on Jesus, and that's that. Thank you, Jesus, right? Praise Jesus, right? I've got a good family, and I've got a good life, and I've got a lot of money. Money's not really a problem. Thank you, praise Jesus. And my kids are all healthy. Grandkids are healthy. Praise Jesus. Right? That's kind of like the mood, isn't it? Haven't you seen that? So, praise Krishna. We hope the same thing too, right? But the whole purpose is to go back to Godhead and to develop love for Krishna. That's the reason that you want that type of environment. Like we also want environments where people are living nicely and comfortably, and where the family all lives together and everyone is kind of happy. Right? We haven't done so well, like at the farm communities and stuff like that. There's a lot of work needs to be done. But that's the idea, is we also want that type of lifestyle, but not just to enjoy it. We want it to form a nice, peaceful environment. So as Prabhupada mentions here, the mind can be peaceful. You see, because if you live in a nice, comfortable, happy environment and your mind is peaceful, then it's a lot easier for you to focus on Krishna. If you're in an environment where your mind is not peaceful, even if it's like in a temple or something, then you're not really advancing properly. Like if you're just miserable and suffering and like having a horrible time, it's very hard for you to chant Hare Krishna nicely. Like if all you ever do is struggle, and all you ever do is like your mind is just out of control and you're just miserable and unhappy, you're not going to be able to sit down and read Bhagavatam. Like Krishna doesn't want you to practice Krishna consciousness like that, right? Like sometimes we think that religion means that I have to put myself into a horrible, miserable condition and suffer and struggle in that condition for God. There may be times and places for that, to really struggle for God or to take on some mantle of suffering, like Jesus, right? There may be some time and place when that's done, but generally speaking, Krishna wants you to be in a situation where you're happy. Chant and be happy, right? It's not chant and be miserable. Chant and suffer. No, you're supposed to actually be happy, and your life is supposed to be together, and you're supposed to be living a comfortable, peaceful life, right? But not so that you can enjoy, just so that that forms a nice background by which you can chant good japa and you can hear about Krishna, and you can assist others in hearing about Krishna and preach Krishna consciousness. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. And of course, we shouldn't think that you'll always be peaceful. I mean, the material world by nature is disturbing to the mind, but you try to make it as peaceful. Try to put yourself in a position where you're living in harmony with your nature and doing as good as you can, right? Okay, so man should lead a healthy life with a sound mind just to realize vidya, true knowledge, which is the aim of human life. This life is not meant for working like an ass or for culturing a vidya for sense gratification. The path of vidya is most perfectly presented in Srimad Bhagavatam, which directs a human being to utilize his life to inquire into the absolute truth. The absolute truth is realized by step as Brahman, Paramatma, and finally Bhagavan, the personality of Godhead. The absolute truth is realized by the broad-minded man who has attained knowledge and detachment by following the 18 principles of the Bhagavad Gita described in the purport to Mantra 10. So this is the path of knowledge in the 13th chapter. 13, I can't remember exactly which numbers they are. The central purpose of these 18 principles is the attainment of transcendental devotional service to the personality of Godhead. So that's the final of the principles of knowledge. Therefore, all classes of men are encouraged to learn the art of devotional service to the Lord. The guaranteed path to the aim of vidya is described by Srila Rupa Goswami in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, which we have presented in English as the Nectar of Devotion. The culture of vidya is summarized in Srimad Bhagavatam 1.2.14 in the following words: Tasmad ekena manasa bhagavan sadvatam pati shrotavya kirtitavyascha dheya pujascha nityada. Therefore, with one pointed attention, one should constantly hear about, glorify, remember, and worship the personality of God who is protector of the devotees. All right, so Krishna is the Sattvatam Patihi. He's the Pati. He's the protector of the Sattvatas, the devotees. So Tasmad Ekina Manasa Bhagavan. So therefore, with one-minded attention, you should Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha. You should always hear and chant, right, and worship, puja, and dhya, and meditate upon, nityada, always, Bhagavan, the personality of Godhead. All right? All right. Pretty cool. So always hear about, chant, remember, meditate upon Bhagavan. Yeah, he's the protector of the devotees. It's very interesting, just the Sanskrit. It's kind of like, basically saying like Bhagavan Sattvatam Pati. It's like a description of who Bhagavan is. He's the protector of the devotees. Okay? So unless religion, economic development, and sense gratification aim toward the attainment of devotional service to the Lord, they are simply different forms of nescience, as Sri Isopanisad indicates in the following mantra. All right. So the next one is, is 12. We've got a couple minutes. Should we just read a little bit on the next one?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. So mantra 12, Andam Dhama Pravishanti Ye Sambhutam Upasate Tato Bhuya Evate Tamo Ya U Sambhutam Rataha. Those who are engaged in the worship of demigods enter the darkest region of ignorance, and still more so do the worshippers of the impersonal Absolute. So the Sanskrit word asambhuti refers to those who have no independent existence. Sambhuti is the absolute personality of Godhead, who's absolutely independent of everything. All right, so this verse is another verse which is like a shocker. You remember there was a previous verse which is kind of like a shocker, which is like, if you develop knowledge, you go to hell, basically, which is talking about like, basically, you have to develop a real culture of spiritual knowledge. So here in text 12, it's kind of like the same thing, If you worship the asambhuta, then you go to hell. And the asambhuta are those who are not independent, which refers to the demigods. Like only Krishna is, just like you have the cause of all causes. Like if you follow the chain of causation, it eventually ends in the one independent cause that's not caused by anything else. So if you worship someone or something that's actually not independent, that is dependent upon someone else, and is ultimately just a link in the chain of causation, then you go to hell. Andam tama pravishanti. You enter into the darkest region of ignorance. Tato bhuye ive tumo yatu sambhutyam rataha. And more so if you worship the sambhuta, which is the absolute truth. If you worship the independent, right? Like more so if you worship the cause of all causes. So it's supposed to make you go like, what? Right? So if you worship those who are not independent, you go to hell. And even more into hell, you go if you worship the independent. Whoa, it's like a mind blower, right? It's like this is going to be, since we're at the end of class, this is like the cliffhanger. Turn in next week, right? And you'll find out what this means. So Prabhupada actually includes it within the translation. He includes kind of like the meaning of it, which is if you just go, is basically, describing what that absolute truth is. Remember in the previous verse, it's saying you have to sort of balance material and spiritual life and understand that material life is ultimately meant for traversing the path of the absolute truth. And now we're sort of talking about what the absolute truth is, kind of getting more into detail about that. And so it's kind of like the verse is sort of saying, this is not the absolute truth. Don't worship the demigods, and don't be misled into impersonalism. Because again, the Isopanisad is talking about who the Isha is, who the Lord is. Okay? It says here in the Bhagavad Gita 10.2, the absolute personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna states, Na me vidu sudigna prabhavam na maharshayaha aham adidhi devanam maharshanam chasarvashaha. Neither the hosts of demigods nor the great sages know my origin or opulences, for in every respect I am the source of the demigods and sages. Thus Krishna is the origin of the powers delegated to the demigods, great sages, and mystics. Although they are endowed with great powers, these powers are limited, and thus it is very difficult for them to know how Krishna himself appears by his own internal potency in the form of a man. So Krishna, of course, is beyond the demigods, rishis, and sages. This is in the beginning of the 10th chapter. Many philosophers and great rishis or mystics try to distinguish the absolute from the relative by their tiny brain power. This can only help them reach the negative conception of the absolute without realizing any positive trace of the absolute. Definition of the absolute by negation is not complete. Such negative definitions lead one to create a concept of one's own. Thus one imagines that the absolute must be formless and without qualities. Such negative qualities are simply the reversals of relative material qualities and are therefore also relative. By conceiving of the absolute in this way, one can at utmost reach the impersonal effulgence of God, known as Brahman, but one cannot make further progress to Bhagavan, the personality of Godhead. So this is a powerful paragraph, and we'll kind of end just talking about what this means. So there's the whole process of via negativa, right? In the West, in Latin, it's via negativa, to the path of negation, which is basically that we know that this material world is not God, right? And we're trying to somehow reach God. So we have to somehow reach God by negating the material energy. It's not this, it's not this, it's not this. In fact, that's there in the Vedic culture as it's called neti, meaning not this, right? Like you're going to understand God not by positively hearing about who he is from the Vedas or the Srimad Bhagavatam, not by receiving positive knowledge, but by trying to push off the material energy and realize that God is not this desk, God is not this floor, God is not matter. Basically trying to somehow just transcend matter by pushing off of it in order to reach the absolute truth. Does that make sense? Okay, but that doesn't really help. That at most that can lead you to the impersonal Brahman. That's as far as human beings can go by their own power, by not accepting a hand up, right? That's as far as you can push yourself off, is just into the impersonal Brahman. And therefore you'll see impersonal realization is all over the world, in many different religions, in many places, because it's basically like the fundamental level you can reach just by pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, and so it's not too hard for living entities or human beings to reach the impersonal Brahman or to have some impersonal realization. It's actually kind of like that. You have that capacity in you. You can do it by yourself. But in order to go higher than that, you need actually assistance from the higher platform. Okay? And so in that conception, now Prabhupada's making a very interesting point here, is that you have an individual then that looks and he sees, on this side you have a world which is full of name and form and qualities and personality. And then the absolute truth must be opposite of this. right? It must therefore be a place without name, without qualities, without form, without personality. It's got to be the opposite of the material. And so it's like you have, here's a world of form and shapes and everything, and here's a world where there's just nothingness, and it's just emptiness, and maybe even just light. We'll allow some light there, And so then you kind of have these two opposites. But that in itself is a relative conception of the absolute truth. It's relative to material existence. It's material, because it's based on the material. It's a negation of the material. Does that make sense? Whereas the real absolute truth is not in any way connected to the material. The real understanding of the absolute truth, it's completely beyond that duality. Okay? What a beautiful ringtone. Does that make sense, though? That, basically the impersonal, I don't think it has. I don't sense a full understanding here. That basically the impersonal conception is material because it's based on the material world. It's based on negating the material world. Because the material world is a world of forms and shapes and personalities, therefore the impersonalist concludes the absolute truth has to be the opposite. But because of that conception, therefore it's ultimately based on the material. Whereas the real absolute truth, the personality of Godhead, has nothing to do with the material. It's not just simply a negation of the material. Okay? No? Still haven't gotten it? Yeah?
So they're basically using the material world as the basis of their conception of God instead of the spiritual world.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's basically what it is. Yeah?
Yeah, I would listen to some impersonalist lectures before I found Krishna consciousness, and people that were listening to this one guru, who I thought was really good, and actually I still think he's a pretty nice guy, but these people were actually listening to him for like 10 years, 20 years, more than that even, more than 20 years, and they still had like not even like a basic grasp of anything that he was saying. Like it was like he was speaking a different language, even though they're all speaking English. He's just like speaking over their head in a way that they're just sitting there like just feeling good and like not understanding anything.
Okay, thank you. It's kind of like this class.
That's what I witnessed in that.
In this class, right?
No. In personalism, it's that way.
Okay, one more question, comment?
So is that why the impersonalists are considered jnanis? Because they're just speculating?
Yeah. So the point is that, as long as you're using the material energy and pushing off of it by negation, you're still attached to the material energy. It's like your conception of the material world is a material conception because it's based on being opposite of the material world, right? Whereas when you accept knowledge from a higher platform, which is kind of descending, totally separate from either, a personal or impersonal conception, then that's actually real spiritual knowledge. Okay, so Krishna exists beyond our own capacity to speculate, either material or, a complex material world of forms and shapes, or a world of negation. So because the nature of the material world is that it's so miserable that we conclude that the spiritual world has to be the opposite, right? It's just like if a woman is beaten and abused and raped, and then she looks at all men as being, abusers, potentially. Right? So it's the same thing that we come to the material world and we deal with form and qualities and personalities, and then we immediately assume that wherever you see form and personality and qualities, it's bad, it's abusive, it's terrible, it's not real, it's material. Right? We condemn it. Therefore, when you see the personality of Godhead, you think, oh no, not another person. Right? Not more personality, not more form, not more activities. That's all terrible, right? It's all suffering. Therefore, it must be material. And spiritual or liberation means to get away from all that stuff. It means to get away from all men, right? That's actually peace. When in reality, there are proper men, there are good men, you know what I mean? And there is a good personality, there is good form and good qualities and good activities. Okay, so that's a kind of like a gross perverted conception of men, born from your own negative experience. So in the same way, to conclude the absolute truth as impersonal is based on bad material experiences. And therefore it's a material conception. Okay? All right, thank you very much. All glories, Prabhupada.
Thank you.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.